We are continuing with our section on the good life and on what makes a life good, what contributes to well-being. Again, just saying a bunch of different versions of the same thing. And let's take stock of where we are real quick. Let me share my screen with you if I can make that happen. Here we are. Today we're going to be considering an objective view of the good life, an objective theory of the good life or of well-being. Let's review where we are and what that means. So we've looked at two different theories, hedonism and desire satisfaction theory, one on which pleasure and pleasure alone is what makes your life good, and one on which desire satisfaction and that alone is what makes your life good. But in looking at both of those, we saw lots of examples of how they can come short, lots of potential counterexamples. Think about, to take just one case with each, think about the case of Truman in the Truman Show. He led a very pleasant life, didn't seem to be as good as many less pleasant lives. Not to say he wasn't living an okay life. I mean, he certainly wasn't living a horrible life. But when we compare it to other less pleasant lives that are actually lived out in full view of reality, people are not being deceived, they're in control or in more control, they're able to travel and things like that if they choose. It seemed like Truman was living a less good life. You would trade some pleasure, in other words, for more control and more knowledge of reality. And that should not hold true if hedonism is true, because pleasure is the only thing that can make your life good. So the more pleasurable life should be the better life if hedonism is true. Second, think about just one of, again, we considered even more counterexamples to desire satisfaction theory, but consider one in which an indoctrinated slave or someone who has Stockholm syndrome, a Patty Hearst type, get what they want, but their life isn't good. They've just been, they've had certain desires kind of implanted, indoctrinated into them. And so they do get what they want, but it's not what they should want, or it's not what they would otherwise want without someone manipulating them. And it doesn't seem like those people's lives are good. Now, that got us asking this question. Well, wait a second. Does that suggest that there are things that can make someone's life good or better that they make your life better regardless of whether you want them, or even maybe even just sometimes when you don't want them, and regardless of whether they make your life more pleasant, right? So considering the case of Truman, autonomy or knowledge don't necessarily make your life more pleasant. You don't necessarily want those things, but they did seem, if you were following along, if you thought, yeah, I would trade some pleasure for knowledge or for autonomy, they do seem to make your life better. Having, non-manipulated desires has nothing to do, you don't necessarily desire to have non-manipulated desires, but it does make your life go better. So the question is, are there things that make our lives go better regardless of what we think or want or feel? Now, if there are, then we've got what we're calling an objective theory of the good life. That's just to claim that there are things that make your life go better independent of what's going on in your head, more or less. Independently of what you want or what you care about or what you take pleasure in or what you believe. These are objective theories. Now, objective theories, make some people uncomfortable because it might seem like you are taking the authority for what counts as a good life out of the individual's hands. And you are. It's out of your hands what makes your life good. Now, on the other hand, you can't necessarily control what you take pleasure in or what you desire. And so even on subjective theories, hedonism or desire satisfaction theory, it's kind of out of your hands what's good for you, right? You can't just decide to desire something that you don't desire, to not desire something that you do desire. You do have some control over it. Let's grant that. Some desires are easier to uproot or to inculcate than others. But even in the case of the harder to inculcate or uproot desires, you can over time do it. This might be part of neuroplasticity, that we can come to have desires, and again, the same thing is going to hold for pleasures. You could you have some control over what you take pleasure in, and especially when you take into account time, right? Over time, you can make yourself take pleasure in things that you otherwise wouldn't, or not take pleasure in things that you otherwise would. Now, all that to say, though, there are still going to be desires which you are just helpless about. You cannot keep yourself from desiring that thing. You cannot bring yourself to desire that thing. If I tried, for example, to get myself to desire or to take pleasure in, on the other hand, genocide, it's going to be a tough call. Or the pain of my children. I want to take pleasure in the pain of my children, or to desire that for its own sake, not in terms of for something else, like, to teach them a lesson. That sounded bad. I'm talking about like slight pains in terms of the psychological pain of being sent to timeout or something like that, or getting a spanking or something. So clearly I can want to do those things as a means to some other ends of them being disciplined or learning a lesson or something like that. But I could not bring myself to want them to feel pain just for the sake of feeling pain, right? I could not do it no matter how much I tried. So all that to say, we might think that objective theories are objectionable because they take the control over the goodness of our lives out of our hands, right? If it has nothing to do with what I want or take pleasure in, then the goodness of my life is determined independently of me. And you might think that's bad. The authority for the goodness of your life should rest in your hands. But as we've just seen, to some extent, and it's kind of hard to compare the extents, but to some extent, even subjective theories entail that the goodness of your life is not in your hands and you don't have control over it, because to some extent you don't control at all, or even if you do, it's hard to control what you desire and what you take pleasure in. So, okay, now Jean Kazez has an argument that I had y'all read for an objective theory of the good life. Now, she had some familiar things on that list. So like we talked about in the last lecture, if you haven't watched it, go watch it, the stuff on desire satisfaction theory. You are not an objectivist. You don't, if you're an objectivist, that's compatible with thinking that there are some subjective goods for people. There are some things, the disagreement between subjectivists and objectivists is over whether there are any objective goods. So if you think there are some objective goods, that's obviously compatible with thinking that there are also some subjective goods. That makes you an objectivist. Whereas a subjectivist is going to say all the goods, everything that's good for a person is subjective, is in their head, is something they desire or take pleasure in or want or believe. And so Kazez is able to say, yeah, pleasure or happiness makes someone's life go better. It's just not the only thing. And there are going to be some things on there that are not what we want or believe, not in terms of what we want or believe or feel or whatever. And so happiness is a familiar item on her list. She thinks someone is doing better in life insofar as they're happy. And similarly, autonomy is a familiar good, not because hedonists think it's an independent good or desire satisfaction theorists think it's an independent good. They actually have to say it's not, because they think in the one case pleasure and in the other case desire satisfaction are the only goods. But we saw it's not uncharted territory for y'all, because we've already talked about the case of Truman, where it seemed like one of the goods lacking from his life, even though he has tons of pleasure, is autonomy. He's being, unbeknownst to him, restrained from doing certain sorts of things, right? He's being constrained to not go on vacation, or at least outside of this very narrow sphere. He probably, anyway, let's just leave it at that. There's lots of things he's being kept from doing, so he lacks autonomy. Okay, so, but she's got a lot of other less familiar things on her list. I want to introduce one of them by showing y'all a clip of a trailer for a movie called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. You may have seen it. It's a great movie. Highly recommend it. I'm going to make sure I share with sound here so y'all can hear that. This is only about a minute and a half.
Hello, I'm Howard Mirziak, founder and president of Lacuna Incorporated. Why remember a destructive love affair? Here at Lacuna, we have perfected a safe, effective technique for the focused erasure of troubling memories. In a matter of hours, our patented non-surgical procedure will rid you of painful memories and allow you a new and lasting peace of mind you'd never imagined possible.
This is a hoax, right?
I assure you, no.
Is there any risk of brain damage?
It's on a par with a night of heavy drinking. Nothing you'll miss.
Actually stop there because the rest of this is kind of just vamping and you know, basically a music video. The premise of the movie, let's get back here. The premise of the movie is this: there's this technology, sci-fi technology, we don't actually have this, but they do it really convincingly in the movie, where you can get a targeted erasure of memories. That part was in that clip. And Jim Carrey has just gotten out of this really tempestuous, I guess, relationship with this woman, who Kate Winslet plays. And she's broken up with him. He doesn't know why exactly, but he's totally heartbroken. He just wants to get her memory out of his head so he can move on. And I won't spoil it for you past that. That's the basic premise of the movie. But here's the question, I guess, that this, for our purposes, this sort of scenario raises. Suppose you could relieve yourself of lots of pain and suffering by erasing some core memories. Now, it wasn't, let's say, you know, it's not just a single traumatic event that hasn't really, you know, become part of who you are. Let's say it actually is a long series of memories that has become bound up with who you are. You could think about the Jim Carrey case, the Heartbreak Case, where you've been in a relationship for who knows how long, years, months, whatever. It's become a deep part of you, and the, you know, working through it or trying to work through it has become a part of your life. Or even more seriously, imagine being married for 30 years or something, and your spouse dying and wanting to get rid of that memory because it's just so painful, or God forbid, a child dying. That's the case that I'm focusing on right now. Sort of haunts my nightmares. Hasn't happened to me, but it haunts every parent's nightmares. That if that were to happen, would I want to erase the memory of that child? It would certainly make my life a ton easier, like way easier. But it seems like if you have kids, even if you don't have kids, you'll probably sympathize with the idea that it would not make my life better. Sorry. It would not make my life better to erase that memory. I've actually lost something really important to my life, even if it makes my life harder. And so, considering this case, Kazez, well, she doesn't actually consider this case in particular, but one of the things she thinks is valuable that makes your life go well is your sense of self, right? And we can imagine, just like I've just imagined, cases where you would have to sacrifice part of your sense of self in order to achieve more happipiness. And it's not an obvious decision. Right. So this is, again, you could conceive of this as an objection to hedonism, because it seems like there are at least some cases where we should pick something even when it's going to result in less happiness for ourselves overall. So it seems like we would say that there's something there contributing to the goodness of our life that's not happiness alone. Right. So I wouldn't want to erase the memory of my child if they were to die. Even though I knew that that was going to just result in far more grief for me in the short term and in the long term. I will never stop grieving over that to my grave if that were to happen. But I wouldn't want to erase it. It would make my life worse, I think, to forget my child. So what that tells us, Kazez thinks, is that your sense of self is independently valuable, independently of the happiness that it gives you, for example. I want you to consider another case. This is not as concrete or fleshed out of a case, but consider two people who are both happy with their lives. They're getting what they want, even maybe. We saw how happiness and getting what you want can come apart, but let's assume that they're both happy and getting what they want. But in the case of Jack, he's a horrible dude, has no moral virtue. You can certainly be happy and get what you want when you have no moral virtue. In fact, it might be easier in some cases. And Jill is happy and gets what she wants, but she's also a good person. She's virtuous. Now, here's a question for y'all. Now, again, you can't answer it, but answer it for yourself. You can even pause and think about it if you're particularly reflective right now. Is Jill better off? Is her life better than Jack's? Now, you got to be careful. We've talked about this before. We don't mean is her life morally better than Jack's. That's obvious. We just stipulated that as part of the case. Her life is morally better than Jack's. But we're asking, is she doing better than he is? Is her life better for her than his is for him? I'm trying to state it in a few different ways to sort of give you an idea. And Kazez thinks, yeah, it's clear that her life is better. And Kazez thinks that that's not necessarily because virtue in itself intrinsically makes your life better. It's not an intrinsic good per se. She thinks it's because it connects you with the rest of humanity and allows you to share experiences, right? So that's part of the nature of virtue is largely social, right? There's people like Kant, for example, thought that, we'll actually talk about this, or we'll talk about Kant, thought that there were self-regarding virtues or self-regarding duties, things that you have just a duty to yourself. It doesn't have to do with other people. But I think most of our duties, at least and most of our virtues that we encounter in everyday life do regard other people. And so the better you are goes to, you could certainly argue the kind of more connected with society you are. And that might hold true empirically. If you think about the people who you know who are really bad people, it's because they're kind of centered upon themselves, and they're often more separated from society than virtuous good people. So in that case, I kind of wonder when I read Kazez, does she think she acts like virtue is an intrinsic good for people? Like it alone makes their lives go better. But then the way she argues, it sounds like it's not virtue that's intrinsically good. It's connection with the rest of humanity or shared experiences that are intrinsically good for a person. And virtue is just an instrumental good. So that's unclear to me. And let's just consider one more case. So here on the left-hand side of the page, I don't know if y'all have seen this before. This is Tom Brady's resume. So Tom Brady, I don't know if y'all know this. I'm not a huge Tom Brady fan. I just heard this at one point and thought it was really interesting. When he came out, he was not a clear top draft pick. He at least had enough worry about his odds on in the draft that he had a backup plan. He had a non-sports backup plan. So he created this resume, and I don't know if he ever applied to jobs, but he was thinking about what he'd be doing if he didn't make it in the NFL. So here's his resume. It tells you a lot about him. But I had a friend once, for example, that knowing this about Tom Brady compared him to Peyton Manning in this respect. Peyton Manning, he said, we all know, well, a lot of people know Peyton Manning was a highly touted recruit out of high school and then out of college. I think he was a top pick in the draft. And then, he did really well, and he's obviously a really likable guy. What's funny, that what my friend thought was interesting was hearing abstractly the stories of these two guys told. Tom Brady, coming up from the bottom, working his way up and becoming great, versus Peyton Manning, who was just kind of always great. Not that it necessarily came naturally, but he said, you'd think that Tom Brady would be the more likable person and Peyton Manning would be obnoxious. He said, but well, in my opinion, he said in his opinion, he thought Peyton Manning was far more likable than Tom Brady. So it went against his expectations. Now that's just an anecdote. What my point here is you might think that we're getting a little more controversial here. But you might think that Brady's life is, let's assume, for example, this assumes a lot, and this is not actually true, very likely not true. Let's assume that Tom Brady and Peyton Manning end up at the same place in terms of skill and achievement, and let's just think about football in particular right now. They end up at the same level of skill and achievement. They win the same number of Super Bowls, whatever. They didn't, but let's assume that they did. And, Tom Brady's still going, obviously. Let's assume that their careers take those different, they end at the same place with the same amount of success. The difference is Peyton Manning was kind of always great. Everyone knew that he had this talent in him. The way was kind of paved for him. And on the other hand, Tom Brady just had to, work his way up by tooth and claw. Pull himself up by his own bootstraps to end up at the same place as Peyton Manning. We could ask, whose life has been better? Who has lived a better life? Tom Brady or Peyton Manning? And the idea here is if you're tempted to say if you're tempted to say Tom Brady, you might be thinking that improvement can contribute to the goodness of someone's life. Not just where they are at the moment or the sum total of goodness or happiness or something in their life, but improvement over time, right? To see that, consider a different case where you have one person who is starting at, I'm going to use a really crude measure here. And let's assume that we can quantify happiness or success or all of these things together, right? Quantify it in numerical terms, right? On a 1 to 10 scale, right? So let's assume that, we're comparing two people. Let's forget about Tom Brady and Peyton Manning for now. Two people, the first of whom starts at a 1. They both live equally long lives. They start at a 1 and they proceed through their life. Let's call it on like a slope of 1, right? Never deviating from that slope on the graph. And they end at a 10, right? So it's a steady increase in happiness and success and whatever, flourishing, up to a 10 from a 1. And the second person starts at a 10 and at a slope of, -1, I guess? I can't believe I still remember this stuff from math. And they have a steady slope downward and they end their life at a 1. Now, if you take those two graphs, you can calculate the amount of total happiness, success, whatever, in those people's lives. And again, on our crude assumption that we can quantify that, they're going to have the same total happiness in their lives or total success or whatever your criterion of value is here. So they're going to have the same total amount at the end of their lives. It's just that one person got better over time and one person got worse. Okay. Now the question is, whose life has gone better overall? And Kazez is going to say, and this is getting at the same question as the Tom Brady, Peyton Manning comparison, Kazez is going to say the person whose life got better over time has a better life. So as they progress according to some metric, whether it's happiness or success or virtue or whatever, that progress contributes to the total goodness of their life on top of all these other things, right? And we can see that by comparing these two cases, two people who have the same amount of all those things, happiness, virtue, success, all the other things that make a life good besides progress. Same total amount, but just different directions. One is progress, one is regress. And it looks like the person who makes progress has a better life, she says. So she thinks progress independently contributes to the goodness of your life. So we're going to end this video here. We're going to stop at this list that she has of the values, what makes it, or the things that are intrinsically valuable for a life, things that make someone's life go better on their own intrinsically. The only one we didn't discuss, I think, is pleasure in good things, right? And I think we didn't discuss that because it's very similar to happiness, but she thinks that not all pleasure makes your life better. And we actually we saw some of these cases when we were talking about hedonism, I think. Hedonism is false if there are ever cases where you add pleasure and you don't improve someone's life, holding other things constant. And she thinks there are such cases, that not all pleasure is good, even though some pleasure is good, makes your life better. Reason being, imagine someone taking pleasure in horrible evil, right? Imagine Hitler taking pleasure in what he was accomplishing in the early 40s. Imagine a pedophile taking pleasure in their pedophilia. Imagine, if you're, whatever, you can let your mind go to as dark a place as you want, people taking pleasure in evil things. Question, does that pleasure make those people's lives better? And Kazez is going to say, no, it doesn't seem like it does. It probably makes it worse that they're taking pleasure in the evil that they're doing. It'd be better for them if they disliked it. That would make their lives go better. You should dislike committing evil or observing evil or something like that. Your life is better if you do. And so that's why she has this last thing on the list, which is she doesn't want to say that all pleasure makes someone's life go better. Only certain kinds, like pleasure in good things. Okay, so we're going to stop there. We've considered, now we're drawing to an end our section on the good life, what makes someone's life go well, what contributes to well-being. Again, to say all of these things in different ways, or the same thing in different ways. We considered some subjective theories, and now we've looked at one objective theory. And I guess I invite y'all to reflect now, and hopefully you've got some space to reflect. We've watched a lot. Y'all have watched a lot of videos. If you've made it to this point, you've read a lot, hopefully. And I guess we looked at a lot of the technical aspects and a lot of the arguments on objections. And here's where I hope that you've ended up after this section. One, I hope you haven't ended up at a spot where you think there's no right answer, right? What my job is, and what our job is in this class, is to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each theory. And look, once you've done 2,500 years of philosophy, which we have, if not more at this point, every theory is going to have some strengths and weaknesses. We've had a long time to think about it. And any theory that doesn't have strengths is something we stopped talking about a long time ago, because it's not worth talking about if it doesn't have any plausibility. And any theory that doesn't have weaknesses is something that we don't talk about because it's obvious, right? So anything we're talking about here is going to have strengths and weaknesses. That doesn't mean that there's no way to answer the questions. You have to weigh the strengths and weaknesses against each other. Even our best scientific theories that we currently accept have weaknesses, and we accept them in full knowledge of their weaknesses. We just think they have fewer weaknesses on the whole and more strengths than the alternative theories, right? And maybe eventually we'll be able to tweak them a little bit so that they have no weaknesses. Who knows? Maybe. So I don't want y'all to end up in a place where you throw up your hands and you say, well, look, I can't solve the problems for any of these theories. So there's just no right answer, or I'm not going to try to figure it out. I invite you to think really hard about it. The activity of thinking about it, I think, is part of the good life. To ponder what makes a life good is part of what makes that life good. That's a weird feature of the good life, I think. And that's also not to say that you shouldn't come down with an answer at some point. I hope that you're not just going to stick dogmatically to your answer. I hope at least if you haven't changed your opinions, you're at least thinking more about the depth of your view, its strengths and its problems. And second, what I hope for you to come out of this section with is, I hope that we didn't get too bogged down in the technical details. The arguments for and against, the complicated objections, the maybe weird sci-fi objections even, where you're thinking, well, that could never happen. Um, because ultimately, these are vitally important debates. We're talking about how you should lead your life. And depending on whether you accepted one of these or the other, you're actually going to change the decisions that you make, the way you orient yourself towards certain institutions and people in your life and goals, big, high level goals that you have. So it's not an idle thing, and it's something of great general human importance. So I hope that you're doing the hard thinking, and I hope that you can see the value of the thinking beyond getting down in the weeds, right? Because you're not going to remember the weeds in a few years. But what I hope you remember are the big views about how to live a good life. Okay, we'll talk to y'all later.